What you see here are 3 pieces of the Book of Creation, Livro de Criação, by Brazilian artist Ligia Pape from 1959, when she was a member of the neo-concrete movement in Rio de Janeiro. Pape was both a poet and a visual artist. She had published a number of concrete poems in the Cultural Sunday supplement of Jornal do Brasil, the newspaper that mainly spread neo-concrete ideas. The neo-concrete exhibitions, though, she only presented graphic works and a series of books, to which the Book of Creation also belongs. The work only seems to refer metaphorically to the concept of a book, as the pages are separated cardboard pieces, usually kept in a box, and they do not contain any words. The pages first appear two-dimensional and need the reader's manipulation so that they unfold into the three-dimensional space and appear like little paper sculptures. Here we see a photograph of one of her early exhibitions. Like the other neo-concrete artists, Pape started her career with constructivism and especially with concrete art. Theo van Doesburg had defined concrete art in 1930 as a realization of purely mental ideas that do not have any connection to nature and the surrounding world, and aspire to provide a universal formal language. Pape's book takes constructivism quite literally and reveals the creative process as one of manual construction. Now, this is the key problematic concerning to a transcultural perspective on Pape's works, I think. One might wonder why a transcultural perspective is needed at all for her works. I think it is necessary because artworks need to be understood in both their specific cultural context and their changing meaning when they travel in time and space in order to be able to create meaning. And this meaning production already starts with the basic work of all art historians, which is description. The key problematic in Pape's work in a transcultural perspective is precisely the idea that her constructivist works need the spectator's touch in order to be completed. Of course, one might argue this is not unique to Brazilian art. Constructivist artists such as Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, for example, also experimented with hand sculptures in Germany as early as 1920. Yet it is the culture-historical context and its historiography that makes all the difference. Western modernity was accompanied by a valuation of seeing and hearing as primary senses for the production of rational knowledge, and the keying of touch, smell, and taste as lower and irrational. The perfect representation of this is the white cube as the ideal exhibition space of modern art. Its regime of behavior is largely still in effect today. Yet the white cube idea, and with it the hierarchy of the senses, has only partially been taken up in Brazil and reflects its fragmented condition of modernity of the country. Owing to its colonial legacy, Brazilian cultural practice has ever since been struggling with questions of identity, often enough in delimitation or even in connection with Europe. Concepts like mimetics, backwardness, and belated modernity are so deeply inscribed in the country's cultural historical discourse that it is practically impossible to ignore such formations when talking about art from that region of the world. In fact, it has also produced some successful concepts of dealing with these accusations in a positive way, such as the anthropophagia concept, for example, that received a considerable attention also by international scholars. Yet art history in Brazil seems to have been written principally against these discourses, when, for example, neoconcretism is inscribed into Rio de Janeiro's peculiar, I quote, Camilo Osorio, geography of hills and beaches that transformed historical social injustice into a creative crossroads where formal rigor mingled with popular energy, end of quote. Or the advantages of backwardness are evoked as a key to the creative change neoconcretism brought about. That would mean that the lack of modern institutions made an artistic movement like neoconcretism possible in the first place. What I want to say is that it is not enough to underline that neoconcretism is a specifically Brazilian kind of constructivism, or that it gives Brazilian art its specific or special local coloring. It is rather the question of how Ligia Pape translated constructivist ideas of the European avant-gardes into a formal language that relies on embodiment that is of interest. And this question needs to be investigated on the backdrop of the Brazilian condition, that is, its colonial legacy with its rhetorics of exclusion and the devaluation on the one hand, and the fragmented reproduction of the hierarchy of the senses imminent to Western modernity on the other hand. Translation is thus a cultural practice that is not limited to language. Translation as a cultural practice is based on a flexible concept of cultural concept that does not part from the idea of faithfulness to the original, but focuses instead on aspects of transgression and modification. It also discloses power relations in this context instead of disguising them. So today, I will specifically focus on the aspect of intermediate translation between visual arts and poetry, because it is particular this interface of these two media that generated the first neoconcrete artworks that addressed other senses than the eyesight. Little attention has been drawn, for instance, to the explicit interdisciplinary mode of working in the neoconcrete movement, especially concerning poets and the visual artists. I argue that it was the collaboration of visual artists, such as initially Ligia Pape and Ligia Clark, and poets such as Ferreira Goulart and Theon Spanudis and Renato Jardim, that created a climate in which increasingly body-focused artworks were produced without leaving constructivist premises behind. I will look at artworks by Ligia Pape and Ferreira Goulart that oscillate between the media frameworks of poetry and visual art in order to explore how the artists translated European constructivist thoughts into their own formal language that also allows to include participatory aspects. For the founding members of neoconcretism, writing and visual art was also entangled on a very practical level. Since none of them could solely live of art making, they all had bread and butter jobs and worked as journalists and or graphic designers at local periodicals, mainly the Rio-based Jornal do Brasil, that also promoted the neoconcrete ideas. This affinity for language and design is also reflected in the references the artists make in their manifesto. It leaves no doubt that they were familiar with the works and texts by artists such as Mondrian, Ventangelo, Elizitsky, and Malevich. Malevich is important to mention at this point because of his opinion about language and visual art, as the neoconcrete artists play basically the same mindset. He also attached great importance to the language as a medium of intervention. For him, painting, writing, thinking, and being could have the same position and significance. Brazilian art historians such as Lourenço Mami and Sérgio Martins state that the connection between concrete art and poetry is both singular in Brazil and a constituent element of the constructivist tendencies in the country. Therefore, it might not be coincidence that the book became a preferred medium of aesthetic intervention for some of the neoconcrete artists, as well as we have seen in the beginning. German art historian Katrin Ströbel affirms that a tendency towards the merging of art, media, can be identified since the beginning of the 20th century. Writing and language, she asserts, are the cutting edge in this development and become constituting elements of many avant-garde currents. Ströbel names quite a few, but strikingly leaves out concrete and constructivist art, while a whole chapter is dedicated to concrete poetry. Still, she concludes that concrete poetry stays within the confines of language-immanent thinking, while the real effort of entangling the two art branches was made by the visual arts. In the neo-concrete movement, this process was absolutely mutual. And more, the relation of art practice and text plays a central role. In their manifesto, the neo-concrete artists claim to reassess European constructivism by precisely looking at their works and not at their theoretical texts, when constructivism is the art genre that most corroborated with theory of all. Instead, the neo-concrete artists based their experiments on philosophy of perception, such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Ernst Cassirer, and Susan Langer. The free association of text, in this case theory, and art practice is already a form of cultural translation. In their works, the neo-concrete artists used texts, well, now poetry, and form as a media of expression of one another, and focused on the place where signifier and signified meet, the sheet of paper, which is also a surface, and the book as a three-dimensional, palpable container object. The very place of neo-concrete artistic practice has, thus, an ambivalent and transgressive nature. Ferreira Goulart was the neo-concrete's theoretical voice. He wrote the manifesto and also the theory of the non-object, as well as in numerous essays defending neo-concrete premises. And as a poet, he experimented with the spatialization of language, ultimately introducing the sense of touch into his works. Goulart approximated in a series of experiments concrete poetry to the visual arts in a way that he himself came to the conclusion that he had reached a final point. He even considered destroying all of his neo-concrete works in 1961 when he was leaving and saying that the neo-concrete movement terminated. The concrete poets conceived of the poem as a visual whole. The poem was supposed to engage the reader like a street sign or an advertisement, an active graphic object that necessarily excludes completely any semantic meaning of the words that create a duration. Yet Goulart noticed a crucial problem in this conception. The graphic reception of the poem, as well as the usually applied word repetitions, ultimately stopped the reader from reading. In order to combine both the perception of the semantic word, sense, and the graphic object, he needed to reinvent the object instead. Goulart's theory of the non-object was published in the Sunday supplement of the Jornal do Brasil in 1960 in the context of the second neo-concrete exhibition. The non-object is constituted as, I quote him, a special object in which one intends the synthesis of sensorial and mental experiences, a body that is transparent to phenomenological knowledge, integrally perceivable, that gives itself to perception without surplus, end of quote. In 1959, Goulart created a series of spatial poems that also have crucial sculptural qualities. Most of them consist of wooden quadratic plates with a small quadratic notch in its center with a geometric figure on top. You can see here it could be a pyramid, a square, or anything that has a square base. In order to read the poem, the potential reader has to lift the figure because the poem, now only consisting of one single word, is hidden underneath. The spatial poem No is made of a wooden quadratic box. The reader has to swing open the black box and then remove the black plate from a now white surrounding, shaped in a square that rests on one of its edges. Then he discovers that there is another red square underneath with the word no written in its center. The reader's role changes significantly in this process of concretion. Like an archaeologist, he excavates the word no hidden by various layers. Color and form become vehicle for the revelation of the semantic meaning of no. They act upon the reader's affectivity by means of visual and tactile impulses. The final layer, the red square that hides the no, works like a stop sign. Form is thus translated into a semantic concept through the bodily experience of the reader, who is now also a participant. The spatial poem Pássaro, bird, functions in a similar way, but acts on a more symbolic level. Made of a white box, its volume is separated by a white wooden plate in its center. If this plate is withdrawn, it reveals another plate with the word Pássaro written on it. The poem is activated through the reader's action, who performs an act of liberation of the bird on a symbolic level when extracting the plate that covers the word. In this poem, the word semantics produces a concrete experience with an abstract situation. The experience of liberating the bird is enacted by means of physical intervention. Yet the liberated bird is only a sign that signifies any bird, and thus creates an abstract situation. This poem plays with the constant translation of meaning from one level of understanding to the other, from lived experience to grasping concepts, and vice versa. The conception of concrete underlying this work functions as a constant transgression of different epistemic systems, the mental and the bodily, theory and experience, abstract and concrete, while the border of these seemingly dichotomic word pairs are blurred and confused. The dialogue between text and form through the spectator's body became quite clear in Ligia Pape's light poems. This was Poemas Luz from 1956 and 57. She used glass plates, later plexiglass, painted with tempera color on one plate of each poem. A conglomerate of colored plates was printed one word, sendo sono em vão, which means being, sleep, and in vain. The glass plates are hung into the exhibition space on nylon strings from the ceiling so that the light can penetrate them. The partial overlapping of the plates created new colors for the spectator. Depending on the lighting conditions and the spectator's position in the space, colors and forms change their appearance, and the plates also produce shadows on the walls. Even though the colors and forms can be perceived from both sides of the plates, the word's meaning is only revealed on one side. The only fixed objects that produce meaning seem to be the words, semantic meaning. But the words Pape used for the light poems are far from signifying objects in reality. On the contrary, she used words that connect to philosophical concepts like being, temporal states of being, sleep, or non-defined action that ends up being useless, in vain. These concepts are debatable, and their meaning is also highly dependent on a person's point of view. They are, in the end, as mobile in their meaning as form and color in the light poems. Light serves as a metaphor in this work that refers to lucid ideas on the one hand and is needed for the shaping of forms on the other hand. Now, we discussed objects that work with text so far. Now I want to take a look at the book as an artistic object that does not even necessarily work with language anymore. Both Ligia Pape and Ferreira Goulart worked with the book as an active object that converted the reader into a potential participant. This development of the book as a spatial entity for artistic activity is crucial to the neo-concrete translation of constructivist ideas into participative artworks. Brazilian art historian Frederico Coelho highlights the transformative and even subversive potential of the book as a medium of artistic action between literature and the visual arts. Goulart's experience with visual poetry and its limitations made him turn to the spatial entity of the book that gives the neo-concrete object's mode of operation a new turn. In the first neo-concrete exhibition in 1959 at the Museu de Arte Moderna in Rio de Janeiro, no other manipulable objects or artworks were shown than Goulart's book poems. Goulart's book poems, the Livro Poemas, work with the reader as part of the text-building process. They give crucial insights to the operative and communicative change the neo-concrete object underwent. The book poems reveal only one word per page, so that the reader must turn the page in order to discover the next word. In this way, the poem cannot be perceived as a graphic object by one glimpse anymore. The reader not only starts to read the words again, but also takes part in the process of creation by turning the pages. The gesture of the reader's action performs the word semantics. It is the third book poem that presents a new conception because it did not have the structure of a book, but of a new touchable object, as Goulart himself confirms. In the book poem Fruit, which is shown here, Goulart uses geometric folds and cuts into the pages. The poem is a spatial bodily experience of the word frutus meaning. Through manual manipulation, the reader performs the act of peeling a fruit when he turns the pages and unfolds the geometrically shaped page folds. Goulart states that he wanted, I quote, to materialize the sensation of opening a fruit through the use of an object, end of quote. According to Brazilian art historian Ariel Jimenez, fruta works analogous to nature as it is produced from the inside like a blossom. Only when the reader gets to the center of the book appears finally the word fruta. The semantic meaning of the word fruta is only revealed through the reader's gesture. Word semantics and objects stand in a constitutive relationship, and the word becomes a concrete bodily experience. In order to reintegrate word semantics into neo-concrete poetry, Goulart thus needed a real object, which is the book. The act of reading, the generation of meaning through the recognition of the semantic value of a sign, takes place through the body. Goulart derives the participative power of later works by neo-concrete artists such as Lygia Clark and Elio Etesica from his own experiments with the book. I quote, "In fact, the origin of spectator participation in the work could not have been more natural or simple. It came from the book, which is, by definition, a palpable object." End of quote. As we have seen in the beginning, artist Lygia Pape also worked with the concept of the book. During the neo-concrete movement, she created different books. The Book of Creation, which I have shown in the beginning, the Book of Architecture, the Livro da Arquitetura from 1960, and the Book of Time, which follows a different concept. The Book of Creation and the Book of Architecture still function similarly to the usual way books work. Unlike pop-up books, they do not unfold by themselves, only by opening a page, but need the spectator's manipulation. Contrary to Goulart's book poems, Pape's books do not contain any words. According to the artist, the Book of Creation alludes to the biblical Genesis narrated by geometrical forms, but the reader can fill the pages with his or her own imagination. In fact, due to the absence of texts in the book, meaning is created only through the individual experience of the reader. The artist states, I quote her, "There is no historical intention of narrating more or less important facts, but rather things that touch all humans in an existential or universal sense." End of quote. Pape conceived of the book as an existential experience of man confronting the forces of nature that is only realized through the reader's or spectator's handling of the pages, who is at the same time constructing precisely the event. Through this close look at the neo-concrete artworks, we finally come to understand how a cultural translation of constructivist premises could possibly generate manipulable little paper works, such as the Book of Creation or the Book of Architecture. It is because the constructive or the concrete is an ambivalent figure in itself that relies on the epistemic system of the culturally formed place of its application. While the spectator's touch appears like a transgression or a modification of constructivist ideas to us, by virtue of the hierarchy of the senses of Western modernity, Neoconcretism finds the concrete precisely in the act of construction. The concrete discloses not through contemplation, but through construction, which is a manual work. As a means of conclusion, I will just briefly touch upon what such a conception of artworks brings about in order to open the discussion. The question of its presentation. Ligia Pape's Book of Creation was first presented in the second Neoconcrete exhibition in Salvador da Bahia in 1960. And it was presented as a touchable object that could be manipulated by spectators. Well, yet, as this photograph I'm showing here reveals the problem best, the work is now untouchable and exhibited underneath a glass cabinet. Ligia Pape herself had an ambiguous opinion about how to deal with the aspect of touch. The Book of Creation is made of paper and cardboard, which are quite fragile materials that get tattered very easily when touched. On the one hand, it hurt her to see the book being torn to pieces, but on the other hand, she thought that touch was crucial to the work. So she redid the same work for each exhibition until she realized that she was trapped in repeating her own work. In the end, she created an edition of 3 equal books and 2 prototypes, which she kept for herself. The book on the photograph is one of the 3 originals, a work perfectly reintegrated into the regime of behavior of the white cube, untouchable and for contemplation only.